Hey everybody, Dr. Sean Talbot here. Thanks a lot for joining me tonight. We're going to have an interesting session, I hope, about what you can see on the screen right now. Nutritional psychology, something I talk about quite frequently on this channel, and this other term that maybe you've never heard of before, something called metabolic psychiatry. Both of these new fields, these new disciplines, really are the future of brain health. So we're going to talk about how nutrition, metabolism, and the microbiome are changing the way we think about mental wellness. And so under that umbrella of mental wellness is everything about how we feel. It's our mood, our energy levels, our mental focus, our stress levels, our resilience, our sleep quality. All of that is under the umbrella of mental wellness, and these are the scientific and medical fields that govern those. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So let me start off with this. I'm going to ask you a question. What if everything we've been taught about mental wellness is incomplete? Not necessarily wrong, but absolutely incomplete. What if any of these sort of conditions, depression, anxiety, ADHD, ASD stands for autism spectrum disorders, burnout, brain fog, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. These are all things that you definitely sense in your brain. But what if they weren't just brain disorders? If they weren't just manifesting in the brain or from the brain? What if they were metabolic disorders also, right? What if the root cause of those brain issues was someplace else in the body? And anyone who's tuned into my channel before knows I talk a lot about the microbiome and the gut-brain axis and the heart-brain axis, and we'll cover a little bit of that tonight. But we're really gonna focus on these new disciplines of nutritional psychology and metabolic psychiatry. But before we get into that, let me give you, if you haven't tuned into my channel before, you need to understand who I am and why I talk about these things the way that I do. So I'm a psychonutritionist. I have a PhD in nutritional biochemistry, also a master's degree in exercise science, and all the other blah 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 that you can see on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's important for you to understand that I come at this problem or these problems from a biochemical perspective. That I want to talk about the biochemistry of how you feel. I want to talk about the cortisol and your stress levels. I want to talk about your serotonin and your happiness, or your dopamine and your motivation, or your GABA and melatonin and your ability to relax and have a good night's sleep, right? That is all, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? If you want to do a deep dive into neurotransmitters and how they have signaling effects across the entire gut-brain axis, go and find one of my other videos where I do a 1 hour deep dive into that kind of stuff. Or join our mental fitness community where you'll have hours and hours of that kind of stuff. Our module on serotonin is 4 hours long. Our module on dopamine is 4 hours long. So you can really get into the nitty gritty if you want to. I also run a company called Three Waves Wellness. We are the holistic mental fitness company. This year in 2026, we were named a Startup Star. So Startup of the Year, basically, because we're the only company that is bringing together all these different touch points, if you will, to help people improve how they feel and how they think and how they perform on lots and lots of different levels. And so a lot of what we do is around this idea of the gut immune brain axis, and we help customers with their burnout and their fatigue and their anxiety and their sleep problems. We're running one of our retreats September 17th, so you can hear about that. You can actually look on my YouTube channel and find a whole presentation about it. We run a mental fitness retreat in coastal Massachusetts. We would love for you to come and visit. We have trained about 1,000 mental wellness coaches through our certification program that is endorsed by, all the leading health organizations: American College of Sports Medicine, National Association for Nutrition Professionals, the American Nutrition Association, the American Institute of Stress, et cetera, et cetera. We have an online mental fitness community where, whether you're a mental fitness coach or you're just somebody who wants to improve your own, mental well-being in a variety of different ways, where you can come on, you can take some of our mini courses, you can ask questions, you can, ask about products, you can ask about regimens, you can put your own situation in there. It's a really nice community with a lot of really good people. And we have some science-based nutraceuticals. We have one called Stress Chocolate, we have a kombucha called Desert Tea, and our flagship product is a stress resilience product called Zenith that works across the gut-brain axis to help people feel their best. And we also have an affiliate program for people who want to also share those products and earn commissions when people buy them. So it's a very holistic sort of an approach. I'll say one quick word about the resilience retreat that we're holding in September. We only have a few slots for it. You get a really nice goodie bag when you come visit, over $300 value, a couple of books, a couple of supplements, a water bottle, that kind of stuff. This isn't your standard retreat, right? It's very much a science-based retreat where we're going to teach you about the biochemistry, and hoping that if you understand the biochemistry at a little deeper level, you'll be more engaged with the kinds of recommendations that we make to help you with your resilience and your sleep and your energy and all that kind of stuff. And what you'll leave with is not just feeling better, but you'll leave with tools. You'll leave with practical recommendations that you can take back to your regular life so that you can improve those things over time. And that's, it moving your body, it's how to recover from stress, it's exposure to nature, it's what food you're eating, it's a whole bunch of really, really good stuff. So that's all I'll say about that. This is our science-based wellness. This is our facility right here. This is also my home. So I'm inviting you right into my home. You're going to be spending 3 days with me, and lots of other people that help us out with our sound baths and our whale watch and our Pilates and all that kind of stuff. But it's very science-based wellness. It's real science, real practices, like things that you can actually do that give you real results. So if you want to hear more about all these different bullet points that you see here, go and watch the video that I did last week. That's posted up on my YouTube channel about our resilience retreat, and you can find out all the details. But it's not, like I said before, it's not your typical retreat. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, which is this idea of a new way of thinking about brain health, a new way of thinking about your psychological makeup, a new way of thinking about your overall well-being. Well, the old way of thinking about it, right? Yesterday's model of brain health was that the brain produced neurotransmitters, and if those were out of balance, if your serotonin was too low, you might be sad. If your dopamine was too low, you might be kind of tired and unmotivated. If your GABA was too low, you were anxious and tense and irritable and you couldn't relax. If your melatonin was too low, melatonin is kind of a neurotransmitter and a hormone. If your melatonin is not where it needs to be, you can't sleep, and you have problems with sleep quality and things like that. So you had a bunch of symptoms. And to mask those symptoms, you took a medication. So you took an antidepressant. You took an anti-anxiety drug. You took a sleep drug. Those sorts of things, right? Pretty easy, right? There's the brain. The neurotransmitters were out of balance. That caused your symptoms. So take a medication to alleviate that. It was simple. It's convenient because your appointment with your doctor would last 5 minutes, if that long, but it's very, very incomplete. And one of the reasons for that is that our understanding of brain science is really, really short. So the timeline of modern brain science really only started in the 1950s, right? So we're talking 50, 60, 70 years ago-ish. It's not a very long science, It's not like, we have, hundreds of years of good research here, right? So we only really started understanding about neurotransmitters in the 1950s, right? What does serotonin do? Happiness. What does dopamine do? Motivation. What does GABA do? Relaxation. What does acetylcholine do? Focus. Those sorts of things. And the first drugs in that category, these SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like Prozac, for example, those really only started coming into the into the offerings in the 90s. Prozac itself, the very first one of these, was only introduced in 1988. So this isn't ancient history. This is a very short timeline of our understanding. So we go from the 1990s to the 2000s, where only in the 2000s did we start to understand that this concept of neuroplasticity, that the brain can actually grow and change and develop either in a bad direction, because of stress and trauma and those sorts of things, or in a good direction to help you with learning and resilience and things like that. This is such a new science that I remember being in graduate school and in college and studying sports medicine and studying exercise science and studying nutritional biochemistry and being taught then, which is not ancient history, being taught then that if the brain gets damaged, it never grows back, right? And that we thought then because we couldn't measure any brain regrowth. So if you got a concussion or you got a traumatic brain injury or you had a stroke or something like that, it was damaged and it was damaged forever. Now this idea of neuroplasticity is that we can actually get the brain to grow and improve even when we're older, even when the brain is damaged, even when we have things that are breaking the brain down, we can build it back up. That's the neuroplasticity concept. The reason that we only found out about that in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, is because we finally had measurement techniques that were sensitive enough to measure the slow growth of these neurons. And so now we know that there's neurotrophic factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor that we can increase naturally to help our brain grow better and learn better and better memory and better problem solving and all that kind of stuff. But we didn't even know about that until the 2000s. In 2010s, this is when these new disciplines started to really start to develop. So nutritional psychology, I'll define that for you in a slide or two, and metabolic psychiatry. This is when these disciplines really started to become, I won't say popular, but you had experts like me who would start to focus in those areas, right? So now a lot of times I'm referred to as a nutritional psychologist or a psychonutritionist because I'm helping people understand the link between their nutrition and how they feel, right? Their food mood connection, if you will. Okay. So, and 2020s is where we started to see the emergence of these compounds called psychobiotics. These are things like specific strains of probiotic bacteria that help you feel better, specific herbs that can help your body adapt to stress, what sometimes we call adaptogens, specific natural ingredients like polyphenols and flavonoids and things like that sometimes we call nootropics because they're brain boosters. They get us to focus better and they get us to think more clearly. Those all come under the category of psychobiotics. They're about helping us feel better, right? Less stressed out and less depressed or more happy or less anxious or more calm, depending on how you want to describe that. And we're starting to emerge into an even more advanced area of psychobiotics that I refer to as neurobiotics, where you kind of go beyond just the feel better, which is really, really important for a lot of people, and you get into the more think better, solve problems better, more mental clarity, and perform better, right? So there's this sort of like mental performance, physical performance kind of thing that actually overlaps a little bit with athletic performance, right? Early in my career, I was a sport nutritionist, right? I worked with the International Olympic Committee and the U.S. Olympic Committee and U.S. Track and Field Association and U.S. Ski Team and et cetera, et cetera. That was all great. But those days, it was about trying to, get the mental edge so you could get a physical performance advantage, which is basically, win the gold medal kind of a stuff. But now we're seeing that idea with neurobiotics for like the average person, right? To just be better at your job, better at your hobby, better at your life. And so that's the concept of neurobiotics that we're starting to see emerge right now. In fact, let me see if I can see it up there. So here's a book called The Psychobiotic Revolution. This is a great book that talks about this idea of psychobiotics. When did this come out? This was published. If you can see this book, I've got highlights all through the book. This was published in. Uh, this was published. Where's the copyright date? Um, Let me see when this came out. I'm not seeing it in here, but anyway, a few years ago, right? Very, very sort of new book, and one that I think you should pick up if you're interested in that idea. But the new model, based on this kind of new science and this kind of new science in my book, and the science of any of the books you can see up there on my shelf. Emron Meyer's book about the gut immune connection. There's lots of them. This is your brain on food, the better brain. There's lots of them. The new science is telling us this. It's the good food, good mood connection. Your food feeds your microbiome. That's the bacteria in your gut. That microbiome takes care of your gut lining. Your gut lining talks to your immune system. Your immune system influences your metabolism. This is how you burn fat, how you modulate glucose levels. Your brain actually uses a lot of glucose, so if you have good metabolism, you're going to have good brain function. And if you have bad metabolism, you're going to have bad brain function. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That influences your hormones and other neurotransmitters. That influences how your brain functions. And the outcome of all that is your mood in a good place? Is your focus in a good place? Yes or no? Is your stress modulated? Do you have good sleep quality? What is your overall mental and physical performance? It really does. The science shows us yes, 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 yes. So much so that nowadays, right? I'm recording this in mid 2026. It is very much a paint by numbers in a sense, right? Check. This food is going to change the microbiome in this way. That's going to change the signals going across your gut-brain axis. That's going to change your performance. And I don't want to sort of say we know we have all the answers because we certainly don't. But we know the step by step by step, and that's important. Because we know that, we can modulate it in the right direction. If it's going in the wrong direction, we can stop that and we can put it back in the other direction. I'll talk later. Let me look forward to my slides real quick. I sometimes include a vicious cycle diagram where you're showing that, if you're eating the wrong food, you're changing your microbiome in the wrong direction. That's leading to inflammatory signals. It's leading to leaky gut. It's leading to immune system dysfunction. That's leading to a lot of these mental wellness problems, right? We're feeling more depressed. We're feeling more anxious. We're feeling more stressed out. We're feeling more, fatigued, all that kind of stuff. And we can switch that from this vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle where we're eating the right foods. It's changing our microbiome in a good direction, which is helping it produce the right kinds of signaling molecules, not just neurotransmitters, but also things like short chain fatty acids and things like that change our immune system in a positive direction, that change our metabolism in a positive direction, that change our hormones in a positive direction, that improve how our brain functions in a positive direction. And then, your mood goes up, your focus sharpens, your stress level comes down, and you're more able to handle stress. Your sleep quality improves, and your performance on all those different levels improves, right? Just because of this sort of step by step by step idea. And because the science has been getting so much clearer and so much stronger over just this couple of decades, really, it has spawned these new disciplines. So the discipline of nutritional psychology is primarily a research discipline, somewhat a practice discipline, right? So when I practice as a nutritional psychologist or as a psychonutritionist, I'm double board certified in nutrition. I hold a license in nutrition. So what I'm practicing as a nutritionist impacts on psychology. It's the science of how food influences influences the brain. Metabolic psychiatry is a little bit different. This is a little more, how should I say this, disease focused, if you will. So that's why I like to use the term psychology, which is about helping you get better, and psychiatry, which is helping you get less worse, less bad, so to speak. Psychiatry is more about treating mental health problems. That's something you might see more with a psychiatrist, with a neurologist, with somebody who's helping you treat a disease, right? That's not someplace where I play. But this is how improving metabolism can improve mental health. So I'll give you an example. People who have metabolic dysfunctions, like irritable bowel syndrome, which is a disease, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis, which are diseases, or somebody who has diabetes, right? Type 2 diabetes, for example, or you have morbid obesity. Those are all diseases, right? Where your metabolism will change. Your metabolism being, your glucose balance, your insulin sensitivity, your inflammatory load. Those are all things that are wildly out of whack. And that has implications for your mental health. People who are in those categories are much more likely to have major depressive disorder, right? So this is sort of like disease linked to a disease. These metabolic diseases are linked to these psychological diseases. Major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Alzheimer's, so like that's the sort of like disease linkage. When we're talking about nutritional psychology, which is what I've been writing about for 30 years, even before it was called nutritional psychology, and that's the work that I've been doing, whether it's products that I've formulated, or it's books that I've written, or it's lectures that I've given, or it's people that I've worked with, one-on-one clients. It's all about trying to take you from where you are and help you get better and better and better. Less about solving one of those diseases, right? Not to say that, people who are in those disease states couldn't also benefit from eating a better diet, or eating less of a bad diet, right? Or taking a particular supplement or something like that. But that's what these new disciplines are. And the reason they exist is because the science has been changing sequentially, step by step over these many years. Okay. So why now, right? Why are we talking about this so much now? Because the science is really exploding. This right here is the one slide that should be your takeaway from this whole presentation. That mental health isn't just in the brain, it starts in the body. And so my students will understand this, that when I talk about the mind-body connection, I actually flip it and I talk about the body-mind connection, because a lot of what happens in your body changes what happens in your mind, right? It goes both ways, right? So the mind-body connection is real, right? When we're stressed out, our appetite changes. When we're stressed out, our gastrointestinal function changes. I've written entire books about the sort of stress response, right? So like that piece, the top down, stress in your brain, changing things in your body, that's a real thing, right? And so I started writing about that 30 years ago. But this newer science about the body affecting the mind is really, really important. And so, if you are in our mental fitness community, you'll have access to these slides, right? That's one of the great advantages of being in that community, is when I do these weekly masterclasses, anybody can go on my YouTube channel and listen to the replay. But if you're in our community, you get the replay and you get the slides. So you have it in your own personal library. So you can go back and, look at this, pause the recording right now and read through all of these if you want to. But insulin resistance. Insulin is the hormone that controls your blood sugar balance. So this not only changes your metabolism, it changes how your brain functions, because your brain is basically the hungriest organ in your body in terms of its need for energy. It's, whatever the statistic is, right? The brain takes up 20% of our, no, wait a minute. It takes up 2% of our body weight, but it uses 20% of our energy, right? So it's a very energetically hungry organ. And most of what the brain wants to use as fuel is blood sugar, glucose. And so if you have problems with glucose balance, you're going to have problems with brain function. Inflammation is another aspect of metabolism that can either positively or negatively influence your overall mental function. And that's because inflammation can block, if it's too high, can block your neurotransmitters. So your inflammation is high, it blocks your serotonin, so you feel more sad than you would otherwise. It blocks your dopamine, so you're not motivated. You guys get the idea. So if we can get the inflammation down or the inflammation balanced, you don't want no inflammation, right? You would just want a healthy level of inflammation, then that can affect your overall mental function. There's also a type of inflammation that we refer to as neuroinflammation, where the brain itself is actually inflamed, and that can affect mood and motivation and cognitive function. So you don't want that. Obesity is very often linked to insulin resistance, right? They're sort of like two sides of the same metabolic coin, if you will. People who are obese generally also have diabetes. And that's one of the reasons that these new peptide drugs, these GLP-1s, Ozempic and Mounjaro and Zepbound and, those sorts of things, that's why they're such a revelation to so many people, because they were originally developed as diabetes drugs to help with insulin resistance. But what was found is that GLP-1 hormone that's naturally made in your gut and has signaling effects in your brain to change your hunger, to change your appetite levels, also has signaling effects in your body. That's the body-brain connection. And so if you can balance that, you can very often see a change in metabolism and a change in your overall weight. So this is also linked to hormonal dysregulation. It's linked to inflammation. It's linked to changes in the structure and the function of the brain. This next one over, mitochondrial dysfunction. This is in its very infancy stages in terms of research, but I think we're going to be, as we learn more and more and more about the mitochondria and how it influences not just cellular energetics, but overall metabolism in the body, including metabolism in the brain, you're going to see more come of this. But mitochondrial dysfunction, if your mitochondria are dysfunctional, they're going to be causing more inflammation. If your mitochondria are dysfunctional, they're going to be causing problems with your metabolic balance, your ability to use different sources of fats or carbohydrates for energy. And so, these are all linked together. And then the easiest one to understand is our diet. If we're eating a processed food, standard American diet, sort of a baseline, that is not going to be good for our overall brain function. It's not going to be good for any of our organs, but especially our brain, because that's going to, remember my slide a couple ago, that food changes your microbiome, changes your gut integrity, changes your immune system, changes the signaling that goes across your entire gut-brain axis, and changes how your brain functions. So we can make that change a positive change by choosing the right foods, or for a lot of people, it's a negative change, 3 meals a day, that is leading them more and more to, low mood and high stress and poor sleep quality, and, eventually not just mental dysfunction, but mental breakdown, right? Where your brain actually starts to physically degrade. And I've done whole seminars about that. So I'm not gonna go into that here. The result is that we end up not feeling the way we want to feel. So if you're talking about it from a metabolic psychiatry disease lens, then you're looking at this increased risk for diseases of depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder, ADHD, other mental illnesses. But when you're looking at it from a nutritional psychology lens, we're looking at it and saying, hey, I might feel crummy right now. I might feel a little bit tired and a little bit irritable and a little bit old and a little bit kind of grumpy and blah, but I can use some of these techniques to help myself feel better. right? And that's the idea of, are we solving a problem, or are we taking somebody in a good direction and improving their performance? But all roads lead to the brain because of all these sort of like overlapping pathways. And so this is why it matters, right? I love to talk about the science, but I love even more to be able to take that science and in a very practical way be able to apply it in somebody's actual life. That's why I do what I do, to help people to take this science, plug it into their life, and get the benefits. And we're in a really unique situation right now where we're moving beyond treating illness, like I just described, more towards optimizing performance, thinking better, being more resilient, which is basically your ability to handle stress, and better overall aging. Our masterclass next week is all about longevity. So if you sign up on my YouTube page, you can subscribe, and whenever those new videos go up, you get notified of it. So I wanted to stay sort of on this thread for a second, right? Two different models, two very different outcomes. The old model is about disease treatment. It's about this idea of, and I kind of liken it to a switch. You either have the disease or you don't have the disease. I have so many people that I either work with directly or I work with sort of indirectly because my students or my coaches work with them and they ask me questions about them, who will come back and will say, my doctor told me everything is normal. Right? I told them my symptoms, we did some tests, and my neurotransmitters came back normal. My inflammation came back normal. My whatever, my thyroid came back normal. Whatever, right? All my labs are normal. We hear that all the time, right? And if all your numbers are normal, why do you still feel so crummy, right? Well, you're normal, quote unquote normal, in that you don't have a disease, right? You don't have a diagnosed major depressive disorder, or generalized anxiety disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You get the idea, right? But there are millions and millions of people that fall outside of that diagnostic lens that still feel crummy. So it's not really this, I think this simple switch traditional model is a little bit broken, if you will, because it's not really about do you have a disease or not have a disease. It's more like what you see on the right-hand side. It's more like a dial instead of a switch. It's not one or the other. It's not black or white. It's really shades of gray. And that's what I talk about when I talk about mental wellness. Sometimes I talk about this idea of the mental wellness continuum and helping you move from a low place to a higher place. We can talk about, it being this dial where it's, you can feel your energy level could be low and we want to, or your fatigue could be high, whichever way we want to say it. But let's say energy is low. We want to dial up your energy. Or your mood is low. We want to dial up your mood. Or your stress is, let me see. No, let me do it. Your resilience is low. We want to dial up your resilience. You get the idea, right? You can get the idea of how it's confusing sometimes when we're talking about, okay, are we talking about alleviating your fatigue or increasing your energy? Or or alleviating your brain fog, or improving your mental focus, right? It's same, right? But it's a dial. It's this idea of meeting you where you are and helping you get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. Not are you energetic or fatigued? It's not one or the other. It's a graded response, right? And that, when you say it like that, everybody goes, well, no, duh. Of course that's what it is. So anyway, the goal is to optimize how you feel, think, and function every day. And there's lots of ways that we can do this. I'll sometimes do with new students, my students that have been with me for a long time know this joke, but so they can see it coming. But I will very often say to new students who are coming through the program, I'll go, do you think it's better for your clients that you'll eventually go out there and be working with? Do you think it's better for us to help them turn down a bad feeling, like help them feel, less fatigued, or less stressed, or less depressed? Or do you think it's better to turn up a good feeling, like helping them feel more energetic or more focused or more happy or more motivated? And I'll ask the student, what do you think is better? Get rid of the bad or amplify the good? And you'll get some who say one or the other, but the real answer is both. And we can do that from a natural perspective. We can help people feel less bad and more good at the same time. And this is this is how we talk about that. So I have this slide. I'm just going to go through it real quickly. This is it says here, modern resilience killers, right? I pulled this slide from another one of my seminars about resilience, how we improve resilience. But this discussion goes along with everything that we're talking about here, right? How do we use these new disciplines of nutritional psychology or metabolic psychiatry to actually do something, right? All right, we just talked about the science of it. We talked about the sort of like theoretical construct, but what do we actually do? And what we do is this. First, we're going to talk about the things that take us in a bad direction, right? That take us down that vicious cycle of getting a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse. And this is because of our chronic psychological load. We're stressed out all the time. We are sedentary, and I mean we as a population. We eat a lot of ultra-processed foods. We don't get enough sleep, right? Hardly anybody is getting the recommended 8 hours of sleep that you need every night. And we have a fixed mindset, right? This goes to, what thoughts are we feeding our brain, right? So that's a diet that your brain is consuming, just like ultra-processed foods are a diet that your mouth is consuming and your gut is consuming. Okay? And I wrote about this first almost 30 years ago in my very first book, something called the Sense Program, where this is the program whereby we fight against what we expose ourselves to in the modern world. And what we do is we fight against the chronic psychological load with stress management, right? We're not going to get rid of the stress, but we can at least help ourselves adapt to that stress a little bit better. The sedentary, we move our bodies with exercise. Ultra-processed diets, we focus on nutrient density, right? Eating more fruits and vegetables, eating more whole foods, eating more, more of the rainbow diet, those sorts of things. We focus on sleep quality. So even if you're not getting 8 hours of sleep, if you're still only going to get 6 hours every night, at least we can make that higher quality so your body recovers better, your brain repairs better, those sorts of things. And we get people focused on a growth mindset. So that's all I'm going to say about this. If you want to deep dive into this Sense program, you can go and look at any of my master classes about resilience, or about adaptive capacity, or about flourishing. There's lots of ways that we talk about it, and the recommendations that we make are all sort of in the same vein. But it goes back to that construct that I showed you a little earlier. This idea of whatever we deliver into the body affects the microbiome, the bacteria in our gut. That affects our gut integrity. That affects our immune system. That affects the signaling molecules that go across our gut-brain axis, whether it's body to mind or mind to body. They are all affected by a program like this, and a coordinated program, right? It's very difficult to say that the nutrition piece is the most important versus the exercise piece versus the sleep piece versus the mindset piece. They're all important, right? And a lot of times what we're doing with our clients is trying to help them figure out what is their primary limiter, what is the thing that's holding you back. And so for one individual client or one individual viewer right now, one of those might predominate. One of those might be more important for you at a particular moment. So that will help us as coaches figure out, okay, this is the one we're going to focus on fixing first, and then once we see some benefits there, we'll move on to the next. Okay, so it's not like you have to be doing all of these perfectly all the time. Okay. I don't want to look too daunting for people. So I think what we're going to see in the future is we're going to see a greater understanding of this construct of the gut-brain axis, that, nutrient delivery and microbiome balance and gut motility and what the gut is secreting in terms of those signaling molecules, the neurotransmitters and the short-chain fatty acids and things like that, how those impact how we feel. Our feelings of anxiety, our feelings of mood, our feelings of stress, and how those impact what the brain is doing and what the body is doing, and vice versa. So I think the next decade is going to be less, as it has been for the previous several decades, as I showed you just a few slides ago. It'll be less about asking this, which drug. It's going to be less about saying, well, is this a Prozac? Is this a Zoloft? Is this a Ritalin? Is this a whatever? And I think it's going to be more about which biochemistry or which aspect of your biochemistry is out of balance. Is it a blood sugar thing? Is it an inflammation thing? We're going to understand more about this concept that food is information. Metabolism drives brain function. Inflammation influences mood, and the microbiome is a huge part of that ongoing conversation between the gut and the brain and the body. And this understanding that brain health starts a long time before anything even happens in the brain, right? Because it's like that biochemical dominoes game, right? Don't just look at that last domino, the brain. Look at the domino before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. I often have said to people who listen to me that mental wellness issues are a multifactorial problem. That it could be your neurotransmitters, it could be your gut integrity, it could be your microbiome, it could be your inflammation, it could be all these different things. And so that requires a multifactorial solution. That's what the Sense program is. That's what a Mediterranean diet is. That's what an exercise regimen is. That's what good sleep hygiene is, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it really is not a magic bullet sort of a thing, as it's been for the last bunch of decades, ever since we started, understanding, Prozac in 1988. Okay, it's not really about drugs versus supplements. It's also not so much about, synthetic versus natural, right? It's not really about that. It can be. So I'm gonna step you through a few things just for you to think about. So let's say we're talking about ADHD, right? Is it ADHD? Is it really a disease, or is it that you just have some brain fog, right? So do you need Ritalin or Adderall, or is something more like saffron or theanine or pine bark the kind of solution that you need, right? I'll use a personal example. I've talked about this for many, many years. In my family, I'm in this category, right? In my family, my kids were in this category. And so what worked for us was a combination of theanine and pine bark and pomegranate extract and saffron and things like that. And we didn't ever have to go to this level of a prescription medication, which is awesome, right? For other people, the Ritalin, Adderall will be the right approach, right? But I think it's good that we have the choice. I think it's good that we, by understanding the science, understanding the biochemistry, understanding this signaling dominoes game that we're playing biochemically, that we have options, right? So, for example, why wouldn't you try saffron first and see if that gives you the benefits that you're looking for, before you tried something more potent and more powerful, and potentially with more side effects. Depression is the same thing, right? Is it depression or is it major depressive disorder? When I wake up in the morning and I say, I'm feeling a little depressed today, I didn't just diagnose myself with a disease. I was talking about my daily mood state, right? Which changes day to day to day. So does that mean that I need a Prozac or a Zoloft? Or does that mean that I can probably help myself feel better with a psychobiotic? Like, there's a very famous combination that's been studied in dozens of clinical trials. L. helveticus R52 is one of the bacteria. B. longum 175 is the other of the bacteria. That combination has been shown to help people feel better, right? But is that helping you feel better, or is it treating your major depressive disorder, right? You can make an argument about that, I guess, right? But I obviously, as a nutritional psychologist, As a psychonutritionist, I'm somebody who would gravitate towards, well, let me try the natural approach first. And it might not be as potent as that other thing, but let me see if that gets me to where I need to go. Let's see if it moves me up the mental wellness continuum. Let's see if it changes this vicious cycle of downward trajectory into a virtuous cycle where, hey, now I feel better. And because I feel better, now I'm making more, better choices in my other lifestyle. I'm eating better and I'm moving my body and things like that. Right? So we could go through all of these. If you read any of my books, I go into the gory details. If you watch any of my master classes, I go into those. Again, is it anxiety? I'm feeling anxious today, or I'm feeling a little panicky, or I'm having a little, anxiety attack kind of a thing. That's something we have on a regular basis. That's not the disease of generalized anxiety disorder. And so do you really need a Xanax or a Valium? I'm seeing these things recommended on TikTok, for goodness sakes, and Instagram and Facebook and, all the social media channels. Well, if people knew that magnolia bark or rafuma or kana have been used by traditional populations for centuries to help take the edge off your stress and your feelings of anxiousness, and you're helping you I was going to say be more cognitively flexible. That's not something that most people say, but help you be able to navigate stressful situations more efficiently, right? Wouldn't you want something like that versus something that kind of, puts a wet blanket over your overall feelings, right? So, I'm saying this from the perspective of somebody who is not at all anti-pharmaceutical, right? For people who need pharmaceuticals, they're there, and great. If that's what you decide is going to be the best thing for you, more power to you. But there are other options out there that can help by modulating these different aspects of the biochemistry, that we've already talked about in the previous slides. ASD stands for autism spectrum disorders. There are drugs that are prescribed. Leucovorin is one, Abilify is one, but most people aren't even aware of the research where fibers like glucomannan, and GOS stands for a different kind of fiber called galacto-oligosaccharide. Those have been fed to, supplemented to, children with autism spectrum disorders, and they've been able to show very reproducible changes in the microbiome, changes in the signaling molecules going across the gut-brain axis, so lower inflammation, different neurotransmitters, resulting in less stress, less meltdowns, better behavior, those sorts of things from a fiber, what we will call a prebiotic fiber. But still, like that's something that hardly anybody out in the public is aware of, that kind of stuff. And, I think as a scientist and as a practitioner, it's important for me to let people know that those studies exist. You can go on PubMed right now and download those studies, and you read them yourself and find out if it's a viable alternative for whatever situation that you're in. And then look at something like Alzheimer's, right? Or senile dementia. This is something where a couple of papers came out just a couple of weeks ago, and I did some little videos you can find on my social channels, about the Mediterranean diet versus a processed food diet, or an anti-inflammatory diet versus a processed food diet, and how it predisposes you to Alzheimer's disease. And if you have Alzheimer's disease, it makes those symptoms even worse. So, do you need an Alzheimer's drug like a Leqembi or a Kisunla, or could you get benefits from something like a pomegranate juice or a Mediterranean diet, or less of the standard American diet, right? Those are legitimate questions for us to have as we move forward in understanding these new disciplines, right? Nutritional psychology and metabolic psychiatry. These are the questions that practitioners will be asking themselves. Should it be a drug situation or should it be a natural situation, right? But so I said the slide previous to this, it's not just about natural synthetic. It's not just about that. But if that's the approach that you want to take, there are lots of approaches that we have available to us. This is the neurobiotic concept, where we can look at different probiotics. We can look at psychobiotics. We can look at nootropics, which are brain boosters. We can look at adaptogens, which are herbs that help you adapt to stress better. We can look at different things that help us with our energy and metabolism, right? Feeding the mitochondria that I talked about, which are going to be the sort of next frontier of thinking about not just body metabolism, but also brain metabolism, right? There's lots and lots of options that we have available to us, and when we do our research, we can see what's going to be the right fit, and figuring out what that right fit is about understanding the root cause. It's about understanding where your symptoms are coming from. Why do you have brain fog? Why do you feel fatigued? Why do you feel old and worn out and blah? What is actually driving that? It's about understanding this underlying metabolism, and it's biochemistry. That's why we talk so much about biochemistry in this channel, because once we can understand that biochemistry and why it's out of balance, we can rebalance that biochemistry to improve our behavior. And the behavior is basically how we feel, how we think, and how we perform on every single level imaginable. It's this idea of like, if somebody's going to put something on my tombstone, it's going to be this: biochemistry drives behavior. This is what I've been talking about for my entire career, and I will continue talking about it. And it's one of those areas that we're just going to be learning more and more and more about, which I think is fascinating from a scientific perspective, but I think it's very impactful from a how can we improve people's lives perspective. Okay, so if you like this kind of stuff, if you enjoyed this kind of information, please go and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can subscribe, and then when I post something new, you get notified of it. When I post something that is going to go live, you'll get reminders about it and things like that. Share this with somebody you think might be interested in brain health. Visit me at doctalbot.com. So there I've got links to the courses that I do, links to the community that we run, links to articles that I write, and blogs, and all sorts of stuff. There's all kinds of free information there. There's also premium information, like our certification program. There's a cost associated with that. Our mental fitness community, there's a cost associated with that. They're all very, very affordable, but there's some things that are free and some things that are premium. And so you can go any of those places, learn more about mental fitness, learn about adaptive capacity, learn about neurobiotics. And with that, I'll thank you. And I will do this. I'll leave you with this page, which is some of the other places, not just my YouTube channel, but my Instagram, the retreat that we run, 3 Waves B&B, the books that I write, 15 books, so you can go read those, leave a nice review. And I really appreciate you joining me for this masterclass tonight. Okay? Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.